The service stairwell smelled of concrete and old motor oil. Phoebe Strand stood with her back against the cinder block wall, a fire extinguisher gripped in both hands, her breathing so controlled it was almost nothing. The way she breathed in an ER bay when everything was going wrong, and she could not afford to show it. Below them on the staircase, boots scraped against steel-edged steps, 3 sets, moving up. She turned to look at Soren Alcott. He stood beside her in the narrow landing, his custom graphite cane held loosely at his side, his pale eyes aimed at the middle distance the way they always were, seeing something no one else could see, or seeing nothing at all, depending on what you believed about him. His jaw was set. His posture was the posture of a man who had never once in his life been cornered. "We have to move," she breathed. He didn't. "Soren." "I know," barely audible. "I can already hear them." She could hear them too, and what she heard was gaining on them fast. Her eyes swept the landing, a rusted utility door, padlocked, a stack of folded chairs, the extinguisher in her hands. She stepped in front of him. His hand closed around her wrist before she made it half a pace. The grip was absolute and effortless. Not violent, simply unmovable, the way the bones of a building are unmovable. He drew her back without strain, and she had no choice but to go. "Put it down," he said. "There are 3 of them, and you—" She stopped, swallowed the rest of the sentence whole. The pause that followed was very long and very quiet. "I can't, what, Phoebe?" His voice dropped into a register she felt somewhere beneath her ribs. He turned his face toward her, those unfocused pale grey eyes finding her face with an accuracy that had never once felt accidental. "Go ahead and finish it." She couldn't, because she had watched him for 6 weeks by then, and she knew that whatever she'd been about to say was wrong. His thumb moved once across the inside of her wrist. The touch was barely there, and absolutely deliberate. "I am not broken, quiet, final. A statement of geological fact. Whatever you think you're seeing, whatever Griffin told the board today." He took the extinguisher from her without resistance and set it against the wall. "Do you understand what I am capable of?" The boots reached the landing below. A door opened. Soren Alcott smiled, cold, precise, and utterly without fear. And Phoebe Strand, who had walked into his life 6 weeks ago as collateral, understood for the first time that she had never once needed to protect him. 6 weeks earlier, Phoebe had been working a double shift in the cardiac unit of Northwestern Memorial when her brother Derek called from a Chicago police holding cell. He'd been there 4 hours. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had already accepted that things were very bad and was only now getting around to telling someone else. The short version: Derek had spent 2 years as a logistics coordinator at Alcott Biomedical. A year ago, he'd signed off on a series of falsified shipment records to cover a vendor he owed a favor. The vendor had been skimming supply. Derek had looked the other way. Alcott's compliance team had found it. The total discrepancy ran to $4.2 million. The CEO of Alcott Biomedical had offered Derek an alternative to prosecution. His sister. Not as anything criminal. The paperwork was clean, the arrangement technically legal. Soren Alcott needed a skilled medical professional to serve as his personal reader and assistant for 1 calendar year. A laboratory exposure 18 months prior had taken most of his functional vision. He refused adaptive technology on principle and refused to slow down on any other. He needed human eyes. Derek's crime would be quietly dissolved. Phoebe would receive a salary that would clear every debt she had accumulated across 3 years of underpaid hospital work and then some. She had 48 hours to decide. She spent 47 of them furious. She spent the last one packing. Alcott Tower occupied 40 stories of Lakeshore Drive, like a monument to controlled aggression. The penthouse level was Soren's private floor, office, residence, and something in between that she couldn't categorize. Wade, his head of security, a broad and silent man with grey-streaked hair and the composed expression of someone who had seen most things, met her at the elevator and walked her up without ceremony. The office ran the length of the north wall, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the frozen grey lake. Soren Alcott stood at the window with his back to her, both hands in his pockets, his posture so unhurried it bordered on offensive. He was not what she'd expected. She had expected someone diminished. He was tall and broadly built, in a suit that fit with the precision of something custom and expensive. His dark hair carried grey at the temples, the faint scarring around his eyes, remnants of what his file called a chemical exposure, but which his face treated as irrelevant history, was the only visible evidence of anything that had ever touched him without his permission. He didn't turn when she entered, but he knew she was there. "Miss Strand," he said to the glass, "you're 17 minutes early. I've been told that's a habit." She hadn't told anyone that. "You read files," she said. "I have people who read them for me." He turned then, those pale eyes finding her with the particular precision she would come to dread and depend on in equal measure. "And now I have you. Sit down." She sat. He didn't. He laid out the terms without warmth and without cruelty. Efficient, the way a man is efficient when his time is genuinely worth more than most people's entire mornings. She would read documents, correspondence, financial reports, and clinical data aloud. She would attend meetings at his side and describe the room, the people, their expressions, what their hands were doing when they thought no one was watching. She would not pity him, would not accommodate him, would not treat any aspect of his condition as a problem requiring her sympathy. It was, he said, already handled. She was simply an extension of that arrangement. "And Derek?" she asked. "Is no longer Alcott Biomedical's concern." His expression didn't shift. "Welcome to the company, Miss Strand." She learned the rhythms of his world across the first 2 weeks. He navigated the penthouse by memory so precise it unsettled her. 43 steps from the office door to his desk, 11 from the elevator to the kitchen. He never stumbled. He never paused to locate himself. She read to him 4 to 6 hours a day. Quarterly reports, FDA submissions, contract amendments, competitor intelligence. He listened without notes and retained everything, verbatim, and recalled exact figures in meetings from documents she had read him 2 days prior. One morning she passed an open door and stopped. His personal trainer was there. Soren was on a pull-up bar, no jacket, no concession to anything, moving with the deliberate total power of someone who had turned his body into a different kind of precision instrument. The tattoos across his arms and shoulders shifted with the muscle beneath them. He was not a man making the best of a diminished life. He was a man who had simply redirected every resource with ruthless efficiency. She kept walking before he could sense her at the doorway. He always could. Griffin Tate arrived on a Tuesday without calling ahead. He was Soren's CO, polished, silver-tongued, with the kind of smile that had been engineered over decades to communicate trustworthiness. He walked past Wade without eye contact and dropped a folder on Soren's desk with the easy aggression of a man who had long since stopped thinking of the space as someone else's. "The Harwick acquisition offer came back," Griffin said. "Higher than before. The board wants a response by Friday." He pulled out a chair without being invited and sat. "Honestly, Soren, given the timeline, the optics, it might be time to think about a structured transition." Soren didn't turn from the direction Phoebe had last been reading to him. A transition to what? "Someone who can be." Griffin spread his hands in a gesture of deliberate delicacy. "Present. Visible. Investors need a face they can read." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "My face is right here, Griffin." Soren's voice was pleasant and entirely empty of warmth. "Tell Harwick his number is still wrong. Tell the board I'll see them at the summit." Griffin's smile faltered. He glanced at Phoebe, dismissive, appraising, the look of a man cataloguing a piece of furniture, then stood and left without saying goodbye. Afterwards, Soren was still for a long moment. "Then read me the Harwick filing from March, from the beginning," she read. Somewhere in the 3rd page she noticed his hand had closed around the arm of his chair, knuckles white, the only evidence of anything at all. The shareholder summit was held at the Langham Hotel in the Gold Coast. Phoebe wore a navy dress she'd bought that morning, the first formal thing she'd owned in years. In the elevator, Soren fastened the clasp of a simple diamond bracelet around her wrist, his fingers efficient and impersonal, a warmth she immediately decided to ignore. 200 people filled the grand ballroom, and all of them, she noticed, looked at his cane, not at him, at the cane. Griffin Tate was already working the room when they arrived, moving through it with a fluency that now made her stomach tighten. Preston Harwick appeared from across the space, silver-haired, heavy-set, radiating the satisfaction of a man who believed the evening's outcome was already written. He shook Soren's hand and said something low and carefully compassionate about the challenges of the past year. Soren said something equally quiet about Harwick's third-quarter numbers that made the color leave the older man's face. Then Harwick turned his gaze to Phoebe, slow and unbothered. "And this must be your helper." Phoebe heard her own voice before she decided to use it. "Mr. Harwick, I'm the person who spent the last 6 weeks reading Mr. Alcott's competitor analysis. Yours came up several times. I'd be happy to summarize what it said if it slipped your mind." A short silence fell over their small circle. Soren's mouth curved, just slightly, and not for Harwick's benefit. An hour later, the room dimmed for the formal presentation. A corporate lawyer Phoebe had never seen stood at the podium and began reading from a medical document. One she had never read aloud to Soren, citing a specialist she did not recognize. Progressive cognitive deterioration, diminished executive function, immediate transfer of decision-making authority recommended. The board members were leaning forward. Several were already nodding. Phoebe stood up. She hadn't planned to. Her legs simply made the decision. "That report is dated January of this year," she said, and her voice carried the way voices do when a room is already silent and waiting. "Mr. Alcott's actual neurological evaluation from January, conducted by Dr. Reeves at the University of Chicago Medical Center, case file 7 Alpha 11134, documents as no cognitive impairment of any kind. I know because I read it to him. All 41 pages. She let the room sit with that for a moment. I can recite any section you'd like." 200 people said nothing. Then Griffin Tate reached under the table, and the ballroom went completely dark. What followed was engineered chaos, designed to create an exit and scatter the room. Griffin's men moved through the crowd. Phoebe grabbed Soren's arm. He was already moving, his cane mapping the floor ahead, his other hand closing around her elbow with a grip that reversed the direction she'd assumed. He was guiding her, not the other way. "Left," he said, below the noise. 40 feet, service door." He was right. He was always right about spaces. They made the stairwell. They heard the boots below, and they arrived at the moment the story had started from. Phoebe with the extinguisher, Soren's hand around her wrist, and everything she thought she understood about helplessness dissolving in real time. He handed her back to Wade when it was over. She did not ask what had happened to the 3 men on the landing below. She had seen enough to understand that Soren Alcott's blindness had been, for 18 months, the most useful weapon he possessed. They did not return to Alcott Tower. Wade drove them to a facility in the industrial quarter of Pilsen. Unmarked reinforced its interior humming with servers and security monitors. This, Phoebe realized, was the real center of Soren's operation. The penthouse was a stage. This was the engine room. She stayed for 36 hours without asking permission. She read documents his team brought in, made the calls he directed, described the faces of the men entering the room when he needed to know whether they were composed or afraid. The team, experienced, loyal people who had worked with Soren for years, began looking at her differently somewhere around hour 14. She stopped noticing when they did. "Harwick's accounts in the Cayman subsidiaries," Soren said at one point to no one in particular. He hadn't slept. He did not look like he needed to. Cross-referenced the March wire transfers with Griffin's personal calendar. "I want the FBI contact at the Chicago field office briefed before 6 a.m. Phoebe set down the report she'd been reading and looked at him across the table. "You knew," she said. About Griffin, before the summit. I knew before you arrived. He was facing one of the monitors. Orientation by habit, not sight. I've been compiling it for 4 months. Then why let it go that far? Why let him try? Because documented evidence is not the same as evidence delivered at the right moment. He turned toward her. The low light of the room caught the scarring at the corners of his eyes, and she held her gaze there steadily, the way she'd learned to look at difficult things during 4 years in the ER. Griffin needed to believe he had won. People who believe they've won stop being careful. She thought of the satisfied set of Griffin's shoulders in the ballroom, the way he'd reached under the table. You used yourself as bait, she said. I used the perception of myself as bait, a distinction he clearly found important. There is a difference between what I am and what people choose to see when they look at me. Griffin Tate was brought in at noon the next day with a lawyer and the worn smooth composure of a man who had prepared his exits. The composure lasted until Soren's legal team began playing audio. 6 months of recorded calls, Griffin's voice unmistakable in everyone, feeding acquisition intelligence to Harwick's people, coordinating the falsified medical report, and in a recording from 19 months prior, discussing the timing of a laboratory incident that would give them a window. That window had cost Soren 80% of his vision. Griffin said nothing for a long stretch. Then, you can't prove intent in a criminal. I don't need to prove it to a jury today. Soren's voice was completely even. I only need to have sent it to the right people this morning, which I did. He stood, without the cane. He crossed the room until he stood within arm's reach of the man who had blinded him, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for anything. You looked at my eyes, Griffin. Every day for 4 years, you looked at my eyes and decided what you saw there meant I could no longer see you clearly. Griffin Tate had the grace, at least, to look briefly like a human being. Get him out, Soren said quietly, and turned away before the federal agents in the doorway had finished stepping forward. Phoebe was waiting in the corridor. She'd stopped pretending she wasn't. Soren slowed when he reached her, reading her position with the particular attention he gave to everything he wanted to locate accurately. It's done, he said. I know, she'd heard all of it. She moved to him, not running, not cautious, just moving, and put her hands on his face, the way she'd seen him touch things he needed to understand. His jaw, the faint scar at the outer edge of his left eye. He went very still and let her, which told her more than anything else he had ever said. The year isn't up, he said after a moment. No. The contract terminates in 4 months. You would be free to leave, legally and otherwise. Soren, I'm telling you that you have a choice, Miss Strand. She kept her hands where they were. I heard you the first time. His hands came up and covered hers, not moving them, simply covering them. The gesture of a man who was accustomed to finding things by touch and had decided, with great care, that this was something worth finding. You stood up in that room, he said quietly, without being asked. You would have handled it. Yes, he said it without arrogance, just accuracy, but you didn't know that yet. Phoebe thought of the stairwell, the extinguisher, the question she hadn't been able to finish. She understood it now. He hadn't been asking whether she believed he was capable. He'd been asking whether she was willing to stop shrinking herself into something manageable on his behalf. To stop performing helplessness because she'd assumed he needed the room. I'm staying, she said. Something moved in his face, carefully, the way things shift in very controlled people when they have decided to let them. He turned his face into her palm, just slightly, just enough. The man his rivals had written off, his board had tried to excise, his own CO had slowly and deliberately blinded. He pressed his cheek into the hand of an nurse from Evanston and exhaled, slow, like someone setting down a weight they had carried so long they'd forgotten they were carrying it. They had thought his condition was a white flag. They had thought the cane meant surrender. They had stood across from him for months and years, and they had looked at his eyes and forgotten entirely to look at what lived behind them.